We had left off in class talking about neoclassicism, and we see it well represented on the right by Jacques-Louis David's Oath of the Sons of Horatius in the late 18th century. The next movement that we'll study is Romanticism, which begins at about around the same time as neoclassicism, and both are products of Enlightenment philosophy. But what we'll see in looking at the artistic production, they are very much opposite to each other. The Romantic movement is based on the philosophy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whereas neoclassicism had been closer allied with Voltaire. And there's a famous quote by Rousseau, in fact, it inspired the American Revolution. Man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. And what Rousseau means by isolating this idea is that he wants man to be free. We're born free, we should be free, but we're not because we are entrapped. We're constrained. What are we constrained by? Social customs, duties, logic. These things get in the way of exercising our total freedom. And this leads to a kind of art that emphasizes individual freedom. And so if we look at Goya's work on the left as a romantic work versus Jacques-Louis David on the right as a neoclassical work, we can see individual subjectivity, subjective thought on the left versus fidelity to a social duty on the right. We can see an emphasis of irrational fears on the left versus rationally motivated action on the right. And as we begin to investigate Romanticism, we'll see that there's a series of major themes that they investigate where constraints disappear. And what we're looking at here, dreams, is certainly one of them. Going hand in hand with that are themes of insanity, even death itself as the ultimate freedom from any kind of restraint. And Goya is showing us someone who's enwrapped with irrational thought, in dreams, in an irrational dream, and focuses very much on that irrationality. That's what makes him a romantic artist, even though the time frame is of the same time as neoclassicism. Now, this romantic movement gains strength in the early part of the 19th century, and it really did become the dominant trend in European art and literature up until at least the middle of the 19th century, at least until 1850, superseding and surpassing neoclassicism as a movement. Now, Goya is in Spain, and he had done a series of 82 etchings that were intended to highlight the stupidity of social norms, how stupid people can be. And he calls it Los Caprichos, which is Spanish for the follies, the foolishness, if you will. And he gives us 82 different images. You can see they're numbered. These are sequential in this in the series of 82, number 42 on the right, number 43 on the left. And they're meant to show, of course, the stupidity of mankind. And they start off rather humorous, funny, they're satiric. People carrying around donkeys who look rather complacent, don't they? A donkey is a beast of burden, and why should a man carry a beast of burden? This is a world upside down, not unlike Bruegel, where you can see, in fact, that the donkey's even wearing spurs to plod his mount around so he can ride the man in through town. And they seem rather happy to have upended the social norm. Again, this is highlighting stupidity. But then about halfway through this series of 82 etchings, they turn very dark. And the moment when they turn dark is the Sleep of Reason image. That's sort of the halfway point. It's a little bit further than halfway. But it's the point when images stop being funny and they start to be really scary. Where we see irrational fears actually taking physical shape. And the things that we fear the most end up being things that are absolutely horrifying. Here comes the boogeyman, a frightening figure from the darkness, terrifying the heck out of this mother and her children. So it seems as if Goya's message is that social norms are often stupid, um, but we have to have a rational view of them. And his image of the sleep of reason shows this moment when reason falls asleep. So it's not like it's a sleep that produces reason. It's actually meant to be a moment when reason has taken a nap, when reason has disappeared. And he shows what happens when we become unreasonable. Monsters arrive, and our thinker, our writer, our artist, maybe, after having fallen asleep, is utterly besieged by creatures of the night. Everything from a lynx to owls to monstrously sized bats that are the stuff of his irrational dreams. And this irrationality can indeed lead us to stupid behavior. So, by focusing on the darkness, by focusing on the fears, uh, Goya in the Enlightenment puts himself very, very firmly in the romanticist camp. Goya himself witnessed the irrationality of humankind because, in fact, he lived through war. Uh, King Carlos IV of Spain was overthrown by Napoleon in 1808. Napoleon installed his own brother as the new king of Spain. Joseph Bonaparte becomes the king of Spain from 1808 to 1814, and Spain is racked by this horrible war. Um, After the war is over in 1814, after Bonaparte is overthrown by the Duke of Wellington, pushed out of Spain first, and then has his overthrow at Waterloo. Um, After that point, Goya offers to paint pictures to commemorate the bravery of the Spanish and the cowardice of the French troops. And this is one of the images. This is the beginning of the overthrow of King Carlos of Spain in 1808 that led to the installation of Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother, as the new king. So, what Goya wants to do with this image is to show the innocence, the bravery of the Spanish victims, and he does that by highlighting them as they're dragged out of the city in the middle of the night and gunned down by these mercenary troops. In fact, they're dressed like Mamelukes. They're not French soldiers, but they are fighting for the French. They're fighting for pay, and that's part of the distinction. A group that's in battle to make a profit on the right, and a group that's in battle for honor, dignity, and nation on the left. All of the victims face us. We get to see the horror in their face, the individuality of the characters on the right, all with their backs to us in exactly the same pose, in lockstep, as this sort of anonymous killing machine. As we look at the victims as they're herded out of the city and to this hilltop outside of Madrid, you can see that all members of society are here. We have monks. Look at the tonsure, the hairdo of the man in green trousers kneeling down. Yeah, he's a brother from a monastery. What's his possible sin? And the man who throws his hands up as if to ask for clemency, as please for don't do this, is dressed entirely in white, the symbol of purity we saw from old religious pictures. And Goya emphasizes sort of the horror of this because it's also extraordinarily dramatic. They're about to open fire, and you know that white shirt is just going to erupt as all of those guns open up his chest. And he gives us a harbinger of that. If you look at the bloody bodies in front of him, just in front of his knees is a huge pool of blood. And then right down, sort of as close to us as you can get, right in the front of the picture, are all of these horrifying dead bodies piled up with wounds disfiguring their faces and bodies. And we can't avoid it. We have to look directly at it. And it's a horrifying spectacle. It's a focus on death and destruction and the irrational postures of man. Who can do this to their fellow man? That's part of what Goya's message is. Now, this brings up a interesting issue that is important for Romanticism, and it's a relatively new aesthetic principle called the sublime. It's a term you may still use, although not in the same way they used it in the late 18th and early 19th century. This was written up first in England and then elsewhere at the end of the 18th century as a new kind of aesthetic experience, a new analysis of what aesthetics are. Aesthetic experience, any kind of reaction to artwork, right? And in writing about the sublime, philosophers said that the sublime was an aesthetic experience that deeply affects you. That's a sublime experience. I think that's why we misuse it now. Oh, that dessert was just sublime, because it's deeply affecting. But they're talking about a sort of an aesthetic experience that it doesn't have to be beautiful anymore. It's questioning what makes art art. And the argument is that, of course, it's the strength of the experience that makes art art, regardless of beautiful or ugly. And Goya gives us works of art that are distinctly ugly. They're very difficult to look at, and horrifying, which fits with this romantic mindset of trying to focus on subjectivity, on irrationality, insanity, death. But it also reflects this new interest in a sort of sublime aesthetic experience, one that's impossible to reject. And Goya uses this a lot. Here's a series of prints he did during the war. He stayed in Spain during the French occupation, and saw absolutely horrific things firsthand, and made sketches after them, and then turned them into a second series of prints called The Horrors of War, The Disasters of War. And these were not even published. They were so horrific until after he was dead by another publisher. And here we see the dismembered bodies of humans hung in a tree. And again, absolutely horrific. Is this beautiful? Absolutely not. Is it art? Absolutely. Does it have an aesthetic experience? Does it have a sublime experience? Yes, of course. It's the sort of image you'll never forget, but it's also the sort of image that you probably wouldn't want to live with hanging on your wall. For Goya, it's perfect because he's trying to record exactly how evil we can be to each other. The sublime and romanticism are everywhere in Europe at the end of the 18th and the early part of the 19th century. And here we are back in France and have an image of sublime horror and death. This is a relatively recent news event. There was a shipwreck off the coast of Senegal in 1816 when Géricault decides to paint this. Is only 2 years later. That might seem like a long news cycle to you and me, but in the 19th century, that's pretty quick in the grand scheme of things. According to the story, 150 crewmen, as the ship wrecks, makes a makeshift raft out of the broken hull of the boat, and they climb on board, and they're stuck at sea without being rescued for 12 days. And at the end of the 12 days, only 15 people survived, and 2 of them went on after their rescue to write about the experience. In order to illustrate this, Géricault, Théodore Géricault, in France, paints it focusing on the horror. And again, it's romantic, it's sublime. The dead are piled up right along the front edge of the canvas. This is pretty much, I got a picture, life-sized, so the figures are full-sized here, and we're confronted with these bodies, with death. The poor man in red contemplating what we assume to be his son as he holds him away from the waters, while others fall into it, almost swept away by the waters. And all of these placed right down close front and center, if you will, to establish this overall theme of horror and death. Now, like I said, the two survivors wrote a memoir, and the report was filled with stories of inhumanity, of fighting against each other rather than fighting to survive, even cannibalism in order to survive for 12 days at sea. And Géricault focuses sort of on the moment of rescue, but not really yet. It seems at this point as if rescue is totally impossible. Here they are engulfed by these waves, almost swallowed by the waves around them, and they're waving at this masted ship on the distant horizon, and it's almost as if there's absolutely no hope whatsoever that they'll ever be rescued, enhancing the drama of it. Now, it was done, like I said, pretty much on a massive scale. The figures are at least life-size. And this is because Jericho intended this as a political statement. It's very politically charged. The captain was terribly inexperienced and incompetent. At least that's what the survivors said. That he didn't really know how to run a ship well, and he had only been appointed out of nepotism because he was the favorite of the person who appointed him. And this brings us back to a little bit of French history. Napoleon had become Emperor of France. We talked about that when we looked at neoclassicism in 1803. And he remains Emperor of France up until 1815 at Waterloo, when he's defeated by Lord Wellington and the British troops who had already pushed Joseph Bonaparte out of Spain back in 1814. Well, Napoleon is overthrown in 1815, and what happened is, at that point in French history, they went back to the idea of a monarchy. And it's a period known as the Restoration, where a distant cousin of Louis XVI, who had been beheaded during the Revolution, a distant cousin is put back on the throne. And they say, okay, let's try this again. The whole revolution didn't work out. It gave us an emperor rather than a king. Let's go back to square one. Let's go back to a monarchy in France. Okay, so that's the political situation when Jericho paints this. France is back under a monarchy. In particular, they're under King Louis XVIII, right? Now, many people were still anti-royalist. Many people held the ideals of the French Revolution and did not like the idea of a restoration monarchy, and were thus quite critical of Louis XVIII. Now, that's where it comes back to the raft of the Medusa. Louis XVIII was the one who had appointed the captain of this raft, of the boat, the Medusa, and had done so because he was a close confidant, not because he had any skill. And when this story broke, when it was in the press and in the papers, people looked at this moment as indicative of how out of touch the king was with his people, and an indictment of the whole idea of monarchy. So when Jericho shows this in the French Salon, it gets amazing press. And in fact, eventually the work goes on tour all the way to England. And the reason is that it was people saw it for what it was, which was this moment in the reign of Louis XVIII where he is shown to be incompetent, and it was seen as an anti-royalist statement, and that's exactly how it was intended. Delacroix, Eugène Delacroix, was a pupil of Jericho. In fact, he's modeled for the raft of the Medusa as Jericho was painting it in his studio. He would have some of his pupils sort of line up and model. I'm not quite sure which one of them he is, but he's known to have modeled for the figures here and studied under Jericho. He also is an anti-royalist, and he gives us a historical scene rather than a newsworthy scene as an indictment of the French king. So what we have here with the death of Sardanapalus in 1827, remember the restoration is 1816 to 1830, right? This is a historical scene of a 7th century BCE, right? Ancient Assyrian king. And as the story goes, he's under siege. His palace has been attacked by his enemies. And as he's seated on his bed, on his throne bed, if you will, he decides that defeat is coming. There's no way that they're going to win. And so what he decides is that he does not want his enemies to get his possessions. And so what he decides to do is to gather all of his riches, all of his wealth, all the women from his harem, all of his jewels, all of his gold vessels, his prized animals, bring them all to the throne room, and we'll all go up in flames together, right? Burn everything. rather than let my enemies have it. And Delacroix depicts this not as a act of heroism, but as an act of utter horror. We see one of his slaves dragging this terrified horse with all the jewels on it against its will. We see the hooves of another horse being dragged in with it. We see another of his servants knifing a woman in the chest, while another looks on in horror. Again, more jewels strewn and gold vessels strewn around their feet. Another woman begging for mercy at his bed, while one is strung up behind Sardanapalus. It's all an image of horror rather than honor. And this is intended as a very anti-royalist sentiment, a political allegory for a monarch out of touch, a monarch more concerned with his own possessions than with the people around him, one who would gladly sacrifice his beloveds, his beloved country, his possessions, out of nothing more than pride. And this was intended on Delacroix's part as a statement against the ongoing French royalty during the time of the Restoration. We can also talk again about Orientalism, which we brought up when we looked at neoclassical art. A decadent leader who would kill his own people, a decadent Arab leader who would kill his own people, presented to a Western European audience as an indicative chapter in Middle Eastern history, and one that is filled with less than honorable behavior. Again, Orientalism is a strong theme in French art of the 19th century, beginning with Napoleon back in the 1790s, and continuing throughout the course of the 19th century. Delacroix himself actually went to French-controlled Algeria in 1830, as France took it over, as France first colonized it. And he made a number of drawings while he was there, filled sketchbook after sketchbook, and 7 different sketchbooks, full of drawings of Arab customs and Arab life. And we have one of them down in the National Gallery, a little watercolor and pen study that he did while he was in Algeria. And he uses these drawings as the basis for many of his later works. This is significantly later, 30 plus years later, and in fact I think this is the year he died. It's very, very late in his career, and it's totally romantic in outlook. We see the darker and more violent impulses of mankind. We see images of carnage and death placed right up close to where we can't overlook it. It's the visual entry point to the picture. Is this horse falling over with its horseman presumably dead, laying right in front of us. But again, this is totally Orientalist in outlook. What kind of scenes do we see of Arab culture at the hands of the French in the 19th century? We talked before about decadent leaders with harems of women. Here we can talk about violent outbursts and kings who are willing to sacrifice other people's lives. This helps again to paint Arabic, Islamic Algeria as a country that is at a lower evolution than France, and thus justifying France's occupation of that country. Romanticism was everywhere in Europe. We've seen Spain and France already. It was also very, very strong in England from the late 18th century onward. Turner is one of the great English Romantic artists, and he brings us a secondary theme. We've talked a lot about death and insanity and irrationality as a romantic theme. But another incredibly strong romantic theme is the idea of the power of nature. And because nature cannot be contained. Remember what Rousseau said, that man is born free, like nature, right? But everywhere he is in chains. Well, nature's never in chains. There's nothing we can do to enchain it. It will always be more powerful than the works of man. And this power of nature theme is something it's under a lot of romantic pictures. I think we didn't talk about it with Géricault's Raft of the Medusa, but the swelling waves around these figures and how they're fighting for their dear lives against the power of nature is, in fact, a very strong sub-theme within this. Turner's also, our boatman here, struggling against these waves, hoping not to capsize as the weather turns dark. The place, the junction of the Thames and Medway, is a place where these two rivers, the Thames and the Medway, converge. And they converge right at the place where those two waterways spill into the ocean, where they meet the North Sea. Now, if you've ever been around the place where major rivers hit the ocean, usually the breakwater is incredibly violent. I grew up in Oregon, and the Columbia River spills in at Astoria, not far from where we lived. And every year there was a boat that would go down because the confluence of the tide from the ocean and the river's current caused a sort of natural rapids, standing waves at the confluence of those two currents. So it's usually always turbulent, and it gets even more turbulent when there's a storm. And that's exactly what Turner depicts for us, sort of puny mankind struggling against much more powerful natural forces, nature that cannot be constrained, right? The wild freedom of nature. As Turner develops through his career, his later works, and now we're about 30 years later in his career, are renowned for an increasingly abstract style, becoming less and less detailed, less and less interested in illustrating what nature looks like, and more interested in what nature feels like. In fact, as we look at the picture, and I've got some nice details of the slave ship, it's up in Boston. As we look at it more closely, we can see that the paint is almost abstract in the way he handles it, scumbled up on the surface and layer upon layer, and that the sun isn't delineated. Right? He paints the diffusion of the sun's rays through the clouds. It's almost as if he's painting the power of the sun rather than the appearance of the sun. And if we look at the storm on the left that's engulfing the ship, I think we kind of see that same idea, that he's interested in trying to capture. Look at those clouds behind the masts of the ship as it's engulfed in the waves. Those orange clouds, sort of in the center of the screen. You can see that he's not illustrating appearances. He's capturing the essence of the power. And this is what I think gives Turner's works such strength, is he's channeling the power of nature into how he applies the paint to the canvas. An interesting anecdote about Turner, he was known actually to read the weather report and then book train flights right into the heart of the storm. And as the train hit the storm, he'd hang his head out the window just to feel the force of nature. Kind of reminds me of like Joker in The Dark Knight when he's hanging his head out of that cop car and sort of slurping. You can imagine Turner doing very much the same thing. And that gave him a sense for what was the true power of nature. And that's what he's trying to capture here in the slave ship. Now, again, it's this theme, man versus nature, right? What can we do possibly to survive? And we see this moment when a ship crashes directly into the storm waves, right? The storm is brewing on the left, coming directly and engulfing the ship. Now, this is based actually on a true story. This is illustrating a particular moment. And the story came from the 1780s. A ship was transporting slaves from Africa to Jamaica. And there was an outbreak of cholera on board ship. And, of course, the slaves are held down below in the cargo hold. And as cholera breaks out in that tightly confined community, it spreads like wildfire and people die instantaneously. And the problem is that the shipping company only had insurance against weather. They had no insurance against disease. And so if they showed up with an empty hold or with a hold full of slaves, or dead slaves, they wouldn't get their money. So the ship captain does the most evil thing possible. He throws all of them overboard, all of them, the healthy and the sick together, and steers his ship into a storm, hoping he can then say that the storm washed the slaves overboard. Right? And then, of course, when he floats in, and he's going to hope the ship's going to be damaged and all of that. And when the ship isn't damaged and he floats into port in Jamaica, he's caught, right? But it's a horrifying story of our ability to be so inhumane to each other. And what Turner captures are the slaves having been thrown overboard. And we see their hands and their shackles coming up out of that abstract churning water. The seagulls coming down to eat at the blood and the body parts that have been left behind. And again, right down close to where we view, right along the front border. Here's a leg going into the water, the ship, or the fish coming to eat it. And we have these fantastic sea monster-like fish here, right? A fin there. And again, the carnage in the foreground, this sort of feeding frenzy. It's again sublime in its approach. An unforgettable visual experience, right? Death and horror close to the viewer, but now melded with that power of nature theme. Another aspect of the power of nature theme is that nature cannot be changed by human progress, that we cannot do anything to fix or alter nature. And this image by Constable focuses on that aspect of the romantic landscape theme. A rural area where Constable grew up. He had since relocated to London. He goes back to visit his childhood home. And he focuses here on a part of that landscape where there is no sign of industrial progress. This is a 16th century farmhouse. That little white farmhouse nestled amid the trees was originally built in the 16th century. And it was home to a farmer who was at this point in 1819, 80 years old. And he had only ever spent 4 nights of his entire life anywhere else but at this farmhouse. And so the farmhouse becomes for Constable, this image along the river becomes for Constable an image of nature unspoiled by the progress of mankind. And that's a theme of the power of nature, another element of it, that mankind's progress shouldn't spoil it. No industrial revolution here. No bridges, no paved roads. When the horse along the path gets to the water, he has to be ferried across the water in a boat, just as they always had been for centuries. Now, it's an absolutely huge picture. It's 6 feet across the base. There it is. It's up in the Frick Collection in New York City, a smaller museum down the road from the Met. And as you can see behind the couch there, it's a massive picture. This was an intentional agenda, if you will, for Constable. Landscapes were not recognized as important art in the 19th century. They were somewhat derided by the critics as being too simple and too decorative. And Constable wants to change that. He wants to be a landscape painter, but he wants landscape paintings to be acknowledged as great art alongside others. And so what he does is he embarks on a series of 6-foot wide landscapes. He calls them the 6-footers. And this was the very first one that he did. And the idea was to do landscapes on a scale that's usually reserved for history pictures. Biblical pictures, pictures of Roman historical events, those exemplum virtutis pictures, for example. This is as big as those and thus as important as those. And that's part of Constable's idea, make landscape acceptable. And he's pretty successful this way. If you just think through, the Impressionists become prominent painters in France because they're doing landscapes. So this was his very, very first 6-footer painting. In order to get these paintings, in order to make them, he began by going outside and making a series of oil sketches. Sometimes they're of the different motifs in the landscape, sometimes they're just the movements of clouds and the breaking of light. And he never intends these to be exhibited anywhere. They're just simply for him. They're for study. How can I translate brushwork into something that looks like clouds? And these small oil studies, these cloud studies, are intended to fill his arsenal so that when he goes back inside the studio to paint these 6-foot pictures, you can't do that outside. And nobody painted landscapes outside anyway at this point, right? But when he went back to do them, he would have this sort of arsenal, visual arsenal of cloud effects. He would understand it and could do it, recreate the idea back in the studio, even though he's not looking at the image, not looking at this landscape anymore. The second thing he did as a step in the process of creating the 6-footers is he actually did a full-sized oil sketch of the composition. So down in the National Gallery, we actually have the 6-foot oil sketch for the White Horse. That, again, he did as preparation for the final picture. What he wanted to do with the oil sketch was simply to work out where everything goes. He wanted to figure out the composition. He wanted to move things around a bit, think of how it all worked through. Also figure out, how big a brush you have to use. Because if you're working small for your other sketches, you need to figure out how wide of a brush, for example, to use for the clouds or for the trees to make it work. And for us, I think today it's impossible to imagine that he would go through the trouble of making a 6 by 4 foot painting and never intend to exhibit it. And that's the case with the sketch in the National Gallery. That was made only so that Constable could work out all of the compositional details, so that when he finally turned to the finished composition, he had it all worked out ahead of time. Well, the painting was an absolute huge success, and he went on to do a total of 6 of these 6-footer compositions over the next 10 years, and really did almost single-handedly elevate landscape painting to a higher art in the minds of critics. Well, there was romantic landscape painting in the United States as well, and again, it seems to focus on the awesome power of nature. We have a scene over a distant valley. We're standing, as Cole puts us here, we're standing up on this ledge, right on this mountainside, and looking over this incredibly dramatic ravine. We have craggy trees in the foreground, clinging for dear life to the rocks, almost like they're images of nature as survival. How does a tree like this survive on such a rocky environment? Well, it has, and it does. And up in the upper left corner, we can see there's still, even though branches have been broken off by storms, the tree survives. It's that longevity of nature that's part of the power of nature. In the background, he gives us this God's eye view over this extraordinary ravine, looking deep into the valley. This is the Hudson River Valley. This is where Thomas Cole is painting. And there were a great number of painters who were working in the Hudson River Valley because it gave them quick access to New York City to sell their works, and also some pretty dramatic landscape to work from just outside of the city. This group of painters became known as the Hudson River School. We should think of the word school as not an educational institution, but like a school of fish, a group of artists who traveled together, the Hudson River School. This idea of this God's eye view over this primordial and spoiled forest at the crack of dawn, with the mist rising from the bottom of the forest, should remind us that something we spoke about before, how young America really began to think of itself as the new promised land. Remember when we looked at Stuart's portrait of George Washington, we talked about that rainbow over his elbow, how that is the promise of a future of God, God's promise of to Noah after the flood was the same as his promise to America after the Civil War. There was a bright future in this promised land. And I think on a certain level, Cole is picking up on those ideas. It's almost as if we see, the first moment of creation, as if the sun is rising, for the very, very first time over this primordial forest. And this is God's creation that has been given to you and me. And we get this sort of dominant view over that creation. Now, this new interest in landscape in America, and particularly upstate New York, coincided with the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825. There was a huge celebration when the Erie Canal was opened, and when it was opened, it was spoken of as part of a broader attempt to push civilization westward, part of America's expansion from coast to coast. Now, you think the Erie Canal is still quite a ways east, but the idea was that it was going to open up trade routes that would eventually push their way west. And what it signaled for people in 1825 when the Erie Canal opened is that America is being increasingly defined by the land of the country. This is very similar to what we saw when we looked at 17th century Holland, that Dutch identity in the 17th century was defined by its land, where they were grabbing land back from the ocean. Well, here, America in the 19th century has very much the same sentiment. As westward expansion manifest destiny, the push westward is taking place. We see a huge uptick, upswing in interest in landscape painting. And that's because I think these landscapes were seen as national identity and tying into that idea of the promised land that's been given to the pilgrims, to the new Americans, to this brand new country. Frederick Edwin Church studied under Thomas Cole in the 1840s. Cole died quite prematurely, very young, in 1848, and Church became the most renowned landscape painter in America after his demise, after Cole's demise, but had originally studied under him. And this massive picture of Niagara Falls, it's 8 feet across the base or so, 7.5 feet across the base, it's huge. It's another excellent example of this romantic interest in the power of nature. And because you can almost hear this picture, the thundering of Niagara Falls as it cascades over the edge. Like Thomas Cole, who he'd studied under, he gives us this edge of the cliff kind of experience where we're looking down over this dangerous view down that dramatic drop off the edge. And in fact, if we think about where the painter puts you, the viewer, right, this is not a safe position where we are. We're right at the edge of the water to where we don't even see the dry land we're standing on. And we are placed immediately adjacent to that horrifying fall into the abyss. It's extraordinary, this picture is. It's painted in the studio. He did studies outside, but the entire thing is painted in his studio. And yet the realism of it is extraordinary. The individual waves and how they kick and how the light plays through it. To think that that's happening from just having studied it outside and remembered it. No photographs, some sketches perhaps, but extraordinary level of realism in this work, which is, I think, kind of an American thing. I think we talked about that in one of the other lectures. There's something American about being realistic. They see it as part of America's identity. We're honest, we're truthful, and realism is exactly that. Well, it also relates to this idea we talked about with Thomas Cole about the push westward, beginning in 1825 and continuing through the middle part of the 19th century. As America expanded west, it opened up more and more of these natural wonders to people's consciousness. Wow, this must be the promised land, because look at the wonders of God's creation that he's now given to us. And things like Niagara Falls to begin with, that's a fairly early discovery, but when they get to the Yosemite Valley and the Grand Canyon later, these became proof to 19th century Americans that this is God's creation that He's made specifically for us. I mean, heck with the people who are already living there, right? This is the white man's view of this entire thing, right? And the wonder of the land, right, is another sign that America is the new holy land, right? That we are the new children of Israel who've made it out of captivity. You know, the children of Israel left Pharaoh, we left England. They traveled across the Red Sea to the Promised Land. We traveled across the Atlantic to the new Promised Land. And that idea of travel in the Promised Land and God's promise to us is obviously picked up in church through the rainbow, that standing rainbow that's at Niagara Falls. You know, whenever the sun comes through, there's a rainbow to be seen because the mist gives you one permanently. Well, certainly that's the same metaphor we saw in Stuart's picture of George Washington. God's promise, this is yours, right? You won't have to go through the trauma again. I am now promising you here in this land a peaceful future. Our last our last area to look at is in Germany. And again, we see romanticism everywhere. In this case, we see someone in the landscape. We didn't see that with Church or with Cole. They both liked their pristine landscapes, undeveloped by mankind. But here we follow this fellow out hiking, and we get to see what he sees. He becomes our surrogate in the picture. Friedrich loves these images of people seen from the back that become our surrogate within the picture. We imagine ourselves standing where he's standing, which is that romantic vantage point, somewhat dangerous, somewhat precarious, but also giving him that extraordinary godlike view over all of God's creation, the unspoiled majesty of nature. We have a somewhat less dramatic Friedrich in the National Gallery. It's one of only, I think, 2 Friedrichs in all of America, so we shouldn't really worry that it's not too dramatic. But at the same time, it deals with this same interest of sort of immersing yourself in all of God's creation. And in many ways, even though the wanderer looms over the landscape, there's something about the vastness of the landscape that just dwarfs human existence. And with the one in the National Gallery, that's definitely the case. We have our 2 little wanderers out by this icy lake on a little promontory of dry land, surrounded by ice everywhere. A small break in the weather. It's not snowing here, as it is today. And the light is coming through those sort of gray, wintry clouds, almost as if it's approaching evening. But they're not daunted. They're out there. And at the same time, they're totally engulfed with, or rendered insignificant by the nature that awes them, that rises around them. When we look at Friedrich's paintings and we talk about the relationship of the viewer with nature, we should keep in mind that in Germany, at least, a number of Protestant theologians in Germany were talking about the wonder of nature, and they were saying that if we study nature itself, we can actually arrive at a deeper understanding of God by studying his creation. And that is, I think, affects how we look at Friedrich pictures, because those theologians are saying that what we should do is we should look at rocks and trees and elements of nature as metaphors for religious truths. And so if we look at Friedrich's picture and we wonder if there's anything here that relates to that, you'll notice that even though it looks like the icy dead of winter, he calls it northern landscape spring. And if we think about spring as a metaphor, of course, spring as a metaphor is a metaphor for rebirth. Easter is in the spring. You know, Jesus rises from the dead. The world comes back from its winter thaw in the spring. And Friedrich in the foreground gives us the snow melting away and the green grass not killed by the deep, frigid tundra-like conditions of the winter, that nature will go on. There's our great romantic theme. Nature will live on. You and I can't handle a winter like that, right? We would die. We're puny. We're humans. But nature lives on. And that's, I think, Friedrich's message here. Not only are people going out to contemplate nature, to understand greater truths, and he gives us again surrogates seen from the back, although from a distance, that are doing that. But as we look at it, then we can do as many are in Germany in the 19th century, and think of nature as giving us insight into greater spiritual and religious truths.